I hope in regards to the dating of the letter that I've both provided readers with a resource and maybe given them an option there. The resources I've got a table in there which spreads over too many pages, which looks at different attempts at, well, it's got the author of the commentary or secondary piece of literature. Then it's got their opinion on authorship, their opinion on the dating, and their opinion on where the letter was written from. And in regard to the dating, you will get it dated fairly early depending on which imprisonment it is. If people think it was written from Ephesus, hypothetical imprisonment, it tends to be dated sometime in the 50s. Some people thought this Colossians was very late, and in fact, dependent on Ephesians, some have dated it into the 130s or even later. Now, I guess for me, the position I came down, I've already mentioned that in the end I thought Paul wasn't the author, so there's a clue to dating after the death of Paul. I also think that Ephesians does know Colossians. There's a sequence of 20 odd words toward the end of the letter where they're identical apart from 2 words omitted in a string. So I think Ephesians knows Colossians. I don't think it's the other way around. Now, so it's got to be before Ephesians. You're still left with, when did Paul die? When was Ephesians written? It seems fairly clear to me that Ephesians was known by Ignatius of Antioch. So it's being quoted by maybe the first quarter of the 2nd century. I would place Ephesians maybe around 90, 100 at the latest. So I put Colossians before that and after the death of Paul. So I end up with a window rather than a precise date. So I date it between probably 65 to 80. It could maybe go a bit wider than that. I'm not entirely sure when Paul died or when Ephesians was written, but I do think it's a 1st century text. I think it's written in the second half of the 1st century, probably in the last third. And I'd narrow it, the narrowest I'd be willing to go, I think 65 to 80. So that would be my take on the date. And again, because I think Colossae isn't left desolate after the earthquake. There's an earthquake in the Lycus Valley, probably strikes around 61 or 62, although the classical authors differ slightly on that. But again, in between probably 60 and 65 at the outer range. Now, people have often said Colossae was uninhabited after that, but the other 2 cities that were affected were not uninhabited. Laodicea and Hierapolis both continued. But what's more interesting is there's been a bomos or a stand discovered which has an inscription on it to Marcianus, I think. No, that's the other one. Is to Corymbus, who restored the waterways and built up the public baths again. The writing looks late 1st century, maybe early 2nd century. So it looks like there was some damage, but someone restored some of the public buildings in Colossae there. There are also other reasons. There's a reference on another text to Marcianus, the son of Marcus, who was the head translator in the city. So it looks like he was a commercial official. Again, this might be a 2nd century inscription. So it looks like continuous inhabitation there. So again, I don't think that it's impossible that the text was written to real people in Colossae after 65. So. I think the text is very Christocentric, and Christology is the heart of the author's theological argument. I think the reason for the author that comes out so strongly is he feels that the believers in Colossae are maybe in danger, be it a real danger, one he thinks is on the horizon, of maybe giving up their exclusive faith in Christ that they feel, as was the case with many of their former religious practices, that you could adopt bits and pieces from different cults. And the author basically says to them, why would you want to do this? You have everything in Christ already. You know, why would you want to have the insurance policy of venerating the rulers, the archons, and all these people who you think might have power over you? Christ has already defeated them. So in some ways, for the author, Christ is so supreme. You know, he is the beginning of creation, and you know, he is also the head of the church. He is supreme in all spheres of these people's lives. So I think he wants to emphasize and get the point across that any type of accommodation of another religion is not just accommodation, it's actually surrender of what they've won in Christ. And I think the rhetorical strategy is very clever in the letter, because he doesn't take them to task at the beginning. He puts forward this Christological statement in the first chapter, and it's almost like saying, you know, we do believe all these things about Christ. You know, he is this, he is that, and he gains the audience's assent before I think he challenges them and says, well, if you believe these things, how can you let anyone deceive you with vain philosophy? How can you believe you need to be joined in the worship of angels? How can you honestly subject yourself to ascetic practices? You know, the answer to all these things is Christ. You have everything already. So I think it is at the center of the letter. Christ is the answer to all questions. So in some ways, any question they want to ask the author, the answer is Christ in one word. And it seems a fairly inane answer, except for the author. It is the heart of the message. You know, they already reign with Christ. They live in the sphere where Christ lives, which is above any so-called power or authority. So they share in that heavenly triumph already. And everything that's against them has already been nailed to the cross later on. So that is the defeat. And I think there's also some very interesting inversions, perhaps, of Roman punishments and Roman claims to power here. I mean, it's Christ who has stripped the opponents. You know, it's Christ who's nailed the charge to the cross. So in some ways, whereas Romans would take their victims, strip them naked, crucify them, this is not the moment of humiliation and defeat. It's actually the moment of triumph and exaltation. So again, I think there's also maybe something that's being directed against Roman imperial religion, or at least claims to Roman power there. And again, that whole triumph is found in the person of Christ.